Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Registered Aquaculture Export Facility Inspection Program, Part 2. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. You are welcome to submit written questions during the conference, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To submit a written question, select All Panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel. Enter your question in the message box provided and send. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. To minimize background noise on this call, please ensure that your audio device is muted. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Liz Fernandez. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with the Professional Development Services Branch, and I would also like to welcome you to today's webinar. As a reminder, if you did not log in with your full name and email, please email Alicia Marston at the end of the program to make sure you got credit for attending today. So our speaker today is Dr. Alicia Marston. She is the Aquaculture Trade Specialist for USDA APHIS Veterinary Services. She works in both the live animal import and live animal export teams stationed in Riverdale and has been with USDA APHIS VS for 5 years. Prior to her current position, she served as a field VMO in Maine and an export VMO in New York. Dr. Marston received her bachelor's in marine science from the University of Maine and her DVM specializing in aquatic animal medicine from the Atlantic Veterinary College at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada. She has experience practicing aquaculture medicine in all major fish, crustacean, and mollusk commodities throughout the U.S. and Canada, Thailand, and Norway, and enjoys promoting aquaculture domestically and internationally through her additional roles as co-chair of the VS Aquaculture Business Plan and National Strategic Planning efforts. And with that, I'll turn the webinar over to Alicia Marston.
Great, thank you, Liz. Hello, everybody. To those of you that were here yesterday, welcome back. And to those of you that couldn't make it, we did record that one. And it will be posted, and welcome to today's webinar. So this is part 2 of our Registered Aquaculture Export Facility Inspection Program, and we're going to talk about more of the updates that are coming into play for this program. Yesterday's presentation, we focused a lot on the documents and the processes, and then how that applies to health certificates. Today, as I mentioned yesterday, is going to focus a little bit more on the facility inspection and that component. We'll also get to an example. So there we go. So we're going to start out by talking about biosecurity and how biosecurity applies to aquatic animal facilities. And then we'll go into a little bit of information about the new inspection checklist, and we're primarily going to focus on the part 1 of the checklist, which is the general facility information. We're going to look at the biosecurity section of that checklist. And then at the end of today's webinar, we'll go over an example. This will be similar to what we did yesterday, but in this case, we'll be approving a facility to export both halibut fish and germplasm, so eggs, to Canada. So this example is a little more involved than what we did yesterday, and we will get started. So to start off, for biosecurity, I know that we have a diverse group of folks on the line today, and you may have anywhere from a little bit of experience with biosecurity to a lot of experience with biosecurity. And before we dive into how it applies to aquatic animals, I just want to encourage you to trust yourselves. And, so many of the biosecurity lessons and training that you've received in the past for terrestrial animals will help you when you're going to an aquatic animal facility. In an aquaculture facility, we're worried about, viruses, parasites, bacteria. There are some pathogens that have intermediate hosts. We're worried about a lot of the same pathways when we are looking at disease introduction into a facility and passing through a facility and leaving a facility. So my hope is to make you feel more comfortable with taking the knowledge that you have already and maybe learning a little bit more today and applying it to doing a facility inspection at an aquaculture facility. So application to aquatic animal facilities. There are 5 principal pathways that we want to focus on for pathogen movement. We want to focus on how disease transmission can occur with animals, what can happen with the water, how we can transmit diseases via feed, and then, the ones we're all familiar with, the vectors and fomites. So in addition to these 5 pathways, I also want to encourage you to think about how pathogen movement can not only happen within each of these pathways, but then at each of the levels within an aquaculture facility. So first, we're going to focus on the premises itself. So the farm or the aquaculture, the building that the facility is in, the premises itself. So we want to think about how can pathogens leave the premises via animals. How can it leave via the water, the transport water maybe that we're taking off of the facility? Are we transmitting or worried about transmitting any pathogens via feed? What about vectors or fomites, equipment, personnel that may be leaving the facility? So we want to think about that on a premises level. And conversely, we also want to think about how can those pathogens be moving onto the premises. So again, through those 5 different pathways, how can we be bringing animals that may have pathogens onto the premises through, say, new animals that we're introducing to the farm? What about bringing them in through water? How about during, if we're bringing feed onto the facility, if the feed isn't already being grown on the facility, how could we be transmitting disease that way? And again, how can we be bringing pathogens onto the premises through vectors and fomites? And then once we look at these 5 pathways at the various levels throughout the farm, that will then help us to be able to understand what biosecurity practices may be needed for a particular facility, for a certain type of species, et cetera, and how we can best support our producers and farmers and exporters evaluate their biosecurity. So this is at the premises level. Then within the premises, we may have more than one population. So at the population level, let's say we have 2 populations on a premises, we want to be concerned about, again, those 5 pathways of introduction. So how could we be moving animals, the pathogens via animals, water, feed, vectors, fomites, into a population, say maybe from another population, and vice versa. How could they be leaving the population and affecting other animals that may be on the premises and that may also, then leave the premises? Then within the population, for this example, we're calling it the tank level. So, you may have multiple ponds within an area, or multiple tanks within a building, or multiple concrete raceways that are one after the other in a concentrated area. So we're looking at that individual tank or raceway or pond level. And then we want to think about how are pathogens potentially leaving that space and moving outwards to affect other tanks in the region, other tanks within the population, and then outside of the population, outside of the premises. And then conversely, how are those pathogens possibly moving into the tank? If we have two tanks next to each other and one is diseased, an example of moving from one to the other would be a net that we use to catch a fish. If we catch a fish that's diseased and we put that without cleaning and disinfecting it into another tank, we are potentially moving that pathogen into a nearby tank. So those are the things that I want to encourage you to be thinking about as you are, getting ready for your facility inspection, as you're looking at the map of, if the facility provides a map or a drawing of their layout, and thinking about how disease could be moving around through those different pathways and through the different levels within the farm. So how does this apply to the new inspection checklist? Just as an overview, for those of you that weren't able to join yesterday, so for the new inspection checklist, there are 3 parts to it. The first part is the general facility information, and this is going to include stuff like the facility's contact information, the accredited vet, noting information such as, what is their water source, what kind of animals do they have on the facility, things like that. Part 2 is the country-specific portion of the inspection checklist. So this is a registration program for export. So in addition to the general information, we also need to be documenting that the facility can meet the country's export requirements to a given country for a given species. And that's what Part 2 is mostly about. And we'll talk a little bit more about completing Part 2 during our example later today. And then Part 3 is essentially the last kind of that we approve this facility, that they're meeting their requirements, and the signatures. So for the first part of today's discussion, we're going to talk about the Part 1 primarily. So as a reminder, the inspection checklist can be found on the Live Animal Export SharePoint page. There is a blank copy there, as well as an annotated version that walks you through how to complete it. And then there are also the examples, so completed examples. So the one that we did yesterday for Peru and the one that we'll do later today for Canada. So Part 1 is the general facility information, and that's what we're going to focus on today at this first part. So within Part 1 is the biosecurity section. So the first couple questions of the biosecurity section are required areas that must be yes. The facility must have these in place. So the first question is, does the facility have a written, effective biosecurity plan? And the answer to that must be yes. What areas of biosecurity are addressed within that plan are not specific for APHIS, and there may be specific to a country, but we'll get into those details in just a moment. So the baseline, the minimum standard, is that they need to have something that is written and effective for their facility, and to address the risks in their biosecurity. So then the second question is, does the facility have evidence that demonstrates employees have read and received training on the biosecurity measures? So the answer to that must be yes as well, whether that is a record of training, logs, whatever it may be. So these are the two requirements that APHIS has for all registered facilities. They need to have a written, effective biosecurity plan, and they need to be able to demonstrate that they do regular employee training. So what you'll see at kind of some of the, at the bottom of a lot of the slides as we go through this biosecurity section is this red flag box. And so the goal with that is to sort of highlight, because biosecurity and pathogen introduction can be very variable between facilities, between even facilities that are farming the same species, let alone between a shrimp facility and mollusks or something like that. So the hope with the red flags are to be some things to just kind of, if you see these on your facility inspection, they may warrant you looking a little bit further into what their biosecurity practices are in a certain area within the facility. So in order to meet these two requirements, the red flags are fairly straightforward. So there's just no biosecurity practices in place. That would be a red flag. They don't have any documentation. That would be a red flag. And both of those things wouldn't allow us to approve them. There's no training logs, or maybe they have training logs, but the last time they filled them out was in 2016. Or maybe it they only trained 3 employees and they have 7, something like that. So looking at their training logs and making sure that they're complete and up to date. And then, maybe they have some good biosecurity for some species, but not for others. Or there may be an area of the facility where it's not as comprehensive as another area. So those are some of the red flags to look at for just biosecurity in general. Then the third question is pretty open-ended. It says, for which of the following areas does the facility have effective biosecurity practices in place? And so from an inspector's point of view, what you need to be looking for is that APHIS does not require that any of the areas that we're about to go through must be in place in order for us to approve the facility. It's more, the purpose of this section is to really document exactly what's going on at the facility, so that, because for our trading partners, we are we have oversight of the facility. So we need to have a general documentation of what kind of biosecurity processes are in place at the facility. But we're not specifically saying if you have this, that's okay, but if you don't have this, then we can't approve you from an APHIS perspective. There may be other country-specific requirements, such as, you have to have a quarantine facility, the quarantine section of the farm for all new animals coming into the farm. That could be a requirement for in order to export to a certain country. We would be reviewing that country-specific biosecurity requirements during the Part 2 of the inspection checklist. So for the Part 1 right here, we just want to be documenting all of the areas that the facility does have in place. So that's why it says check all that apply, and it's a required question, but there isn't a right or wrong answer. So then within this third question, we'll go through them one by one. So the first one talks about animal sources. Does the facility have quarantine acclimation protocols, disease testing? Do they have movement or separation of animals within the facility? So if they have a quarantine area, some things to look for is, making sure that that quarantine area is actually separate from the animals on the rest of the farm. An open-aired pond that they say, yeah, we just, we stick the fish down there for a little while and then move them on to the rest of the facility that's right next to all of the other ponds isn't a good quarantine area. You want to look for separate water sources or a separate flow of the water to the quarantine, and also separate effluent. So the water coming out of the quarantine facility should not be going back into the facility where the rest of the animals are unless there's some kind of treatment. The quarantine facility, the quarantine area should have separate equipment if possible, and either dedicated personnel or just like we would on, you know, a poultry facility or a swine facility, you want to move, if you don't have dedicated personnel, then you want to move from the populations of the animals that are the lowest to the highest risk. So you want to do the quarantine animals last after you've finished taking care of the other life stages and other groups within the farm. So some of the red flags to look for are that the quarantine area shares space with other parts of the facility, that there's shared equipment that's moving between the quarantine and other parts of the facility, or shared water between the quarantine area and other parts of the facility. They may have some disease testing requirement, disease testing biosecurity in place, so making sure that the animals that they have on the farm are healthy and doing regular surveillance. So they may have species-specific testing protocols. They may have documentation of pathogen freedom, that they are regularly looking at their mortality records. And one of the red flags would be if their mortality rates are exceeding their expected thresholds. Most facilities have an expected percentage of animals that they lose, whether it's when they move them from one part of the farm to another, whether it's just the natural maturation process. So if those mortality rates are exceeding those thresholds, it's something that should throw up a red flag and maybe warrant some additional biosecurity. Sorry about that. Liz, do you know how to get rid of the menu that's at the bottom? I can't see the bottom of my slide.
Could you try clicking back on your slide there, Alicia?
Yep. It's still there.
Really? Because I can't see it.
Okay.
So if you click back on the slide, it doesn't go away?
No. Okay, that's all right. I will work around it. So the last red flag on this one, I think it says no testing and no documentation of the disease status. So if they're not doing any kind of testing or recording any of the testing, then that would be a red flag that you might want to look into further. Then the next section for animals is looking at animal separation. So just like we do on a poultry farm or a swine facility, you want to have a line of separation between different types of animals if possible. In this picture, in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a hatchery, and then leading out from the hatchery, there's a series of ponds as well as around the facility. And then where the salmon is the broodstock facility. So you can see that they have each part of the process, the management process, separated out with separation, physical separation between those different ages of animals. You also want to make sure that you're providing access control to all of those, to each of those different areas, and that there are areas for decontamination for both people and vehicles coming in and out of those parts within the farm. Then around the farm itself, you want to have some sort of a perimeter buffer area, and that will look different for land-based facilities versus other open net pen, that kind of thing, it really can vary, but you want to have some sort of a perimeter buffer for best biosecurity. So red flags would include no separation between animals of different health status, or there's no separation of the premises from its surroundings. So even if it's a land-based facility, but it's right on the edge of a lake and there's no separation between those two things, that would be a red flag. The next section we're going to talk about of biosecurity is water. So looking at the water source, the system water, the water that is within the farm, and then also the shipping water. Some red flags for improper water biosecurity would be if there's an unknown water supply, if the system water that is going to most of the animals is also being used for the animals that are in quarantine and that water is being shared, and if they're using surface water and it's not being properly treated. We'll go into that one in just a second. So for the source water, the water source, there's typically, the influent water is the water coming into the facility. And there's typically going to be 3 types of sources of influent water. One is municipal, so it's coming from city or town water supply, which typically has, some sort of municipal treatment and usually is usually going to be pathogen-free, or at least a very low, it's low risk for bringing pathogens of concern onto an aquaculture farm. The other is going to be groundwater, so water that's coming from a closed well or a spring. And then the third type is surface water, so basically anything that's kind of at the ground level, so not down deep in, under the ground like the wells or the springs, but the surface. So an open spring, a pond, a lake, a creek, a river, that kind of thing. So and depending on where the water comes from, where the water is being sourced from, will affect any kind of treatment. So like I mentioned, you have a very low risk of pathogen introduction from municipal sources and from groundwater. So there isn't necessarily treatment that will be needed to go from those sources into where the animals are being housed. If they're getting their water from a surface location, then there's a much higher risk that there's going to be pathogen introduction via water through that pathway. So you want to make sure that there's some sort of treatment, and that the treatment is whether it's UV sterilization, ozone, biological filtration, mechanical filtration, chemical disinfection. There's a lot of different types of treatment. And it will, what is needed will depend on the facility and the diseases that they're concerned about. But you're really going to want to make sure that there's some sort of treatment in place for that surface water before it's going into where the animals are being held. So now that we're into the facility, we want to look at the water flow through the facility. And there's two common sort of buckets of how water flows through a facility. One is flow through, which is kind of self-explanatory. Basically, the influent water comes in, flows directly through the facility, and then goes out. And it's not reused anywhere. It doesn't double back anywhere. It just goes straight through. And so for a flow-through system, you want to make sure that it's being set up so that you're going from the highest to the lowest health status. So, your brood stock through your grow out, and then out the other side. If you have a recirculation, which is the other most common type of water, system water, you want to make sure that there's some kind of treatment before that water is cycling back into the facility. So once it's gone through all the tanks that it's going to go through, or all the raceways that it's going to go through, before it goes back to the beginning or back introduced into part of the facility, you want to be looking for some sort of biosecurity, some sort of treatment to that water. You don't want to, as the third option on this flow chart, you don't want to see that water just going right back into the facility, because you're really increasing your risk that you're just going to send pathogens within the facility that way. And then for shipping water, you either have no treatment of that water or you do have treatment of the water. So in general, if you're not going to treat the water that's being shipped, you want to make sure that the water you're sending animals in, so when for our facilities that are exporting live aquatic animals, they're sending those animals in water and with oxygen and in bags, and then those bags are going inside boxes. So you want to make sure that the water that's being added to the animals is of equal or higher health status. And I recognize that there's a lot of arrows on this flow chart, but I'll walk you through it. So for the blue box at the top, that would be the animals of the highest health status. You only want to use water from the highest health status to go with those animals for that shipment. For animals that are in a middle health status on the facility, you could use water from that middle range where they've been kept, or you could also use some water from a higher health status on the facility. But you don't want to use it from a population that would be the lowest health status. So, freshly introduced animals in quarantine, you wouldn't want to use that water for shipment. So if you're not going to do any treatment, then you want it to come from equal or higher health status of the animals that are being shipped. If you're going to treat the shipment water, then you want to make sure that whatever treatment's being done is going to address the diseases of concern for that species before you use it as shipping water. The next area we're going to cover is feed and storage. So the kind of feed on an aquatic animal facility will really vary. You have a lot of fish farms that use a commercial pelleted feed that looks very similar to what we use for dogs and cats, for example. There are also certain animals that only can eat a wet feed. So it's something that is, it doesn't go through that process of that the commercial feed does, being put into a pellet, so it doesn't quite last as long. You need to maintain it a little bit differently. There's also a lot of species, and especially younger life stages, that are being farmed where they need a constant supply of live feed, so small little copepods, and so there will actually be areas of the facility that are just dedicated to constantly producing live feed for the animals. So it will depend on what you see. The facility will, the types of feed will depend on the types of animals and life stages that they have. But some red flags would be, any spoiled or expired feed that's laying around. That should be moribund or deceased live feed. Should say that, the feed has expired. And then the last one down there, talking about, you may have feed that the facility has bought, but they don't know exactly where it came from, or they don't have any kind of certification that it's coming from a pathogen-free or a negative health status. For example, with shrimp, we often use polychaete worms or other types of crustaceans, and those could be carrying diseases of concern to the population that we're feeding. So we want to make sure that they're coming from a healthy source before we feed those to the animals that are on the premises. And then also that they have feed inventory protocols and that they're tracking all of that information. Vectors and fomites is a big category. You know, it can be anything from dedicated equipment on the facility, including cleaning and disinfection protocols, the use of fallowing practices, which means that you're basically leaving an area that is used to raise animals, you're leaving it empty for a period of time. So with a tank, you would, once all the animals have been harvested or moved to another area, you would drain it down, clean it, let it dry, and disinfect it, and then just let it sit for a little bit to kind of break any life cycle of pathogens that you might be concerned about. Also, you know, proper carcass disposal and making sure that you have some sort of pest or predator control. So for the equipment, you want to look for dedicated equipment, or if there isn't dedicated equipment to each area, then making sure that there's biosecurity practices that include cleaning and disinfection before they're moving the equipment between different areas of different health status. And another thing that's also important, just like with terrestrial animals, is that you're using cleaning and disinfection agents that are appropriate for the diseases that you're concerned about. You're not going to use, there may be some cases where bleach is fine, but it won't, but for other pathogens, you may want to use a Virkon, for example. So that will depend on the facility. It will depend on the types of animals that are in the facility and what diseases they're susceptible to and what diseases you're concerned about, and making sure that the cleaning agents are appropriate. In this picture here, you can see that there are some nets over to the right-hand side there. There are some buckets inside, so maybe this is dedicated equipment. I would prefer to see those nets enclosed inside that facility and not on the outside, potentially exposed to pathogens on the outside of the building. Having a foot bath as you're going in and out, eliminating any kind of standing water, things like that. You also want to think about vehicle traffic. An aquaculture facility doesn't typically have a lot of the same farming equipment that you would see on with other types of commodities, but you do have large trucks that are bringing in feed. You have trucks. Some facilities truck in their water. So all of that vehicle traffic, you want to make sure is occurring away from the animals, and even preferably that if there are dedicated vehicles that stay on the premises itself. So some of your red flags for the equipment would be if they don't have dedicated equipment, if there's no cleaning and disinfection of shared equipment between animals of different health status, and if there's a lack of cleaning and disinfection for the personnel, so foot baths, hand washing stations, things like that. Then when we look at pest and predator control, this will also vary. So I tried to give a couple of different examples that would cover a variety of different aquaculture settings. So if you have open ponds or raceways, or you have a lot of tanks situated together, having some sort of netting over the top will, prevent birds or other predators from coming in and taking animals out of that pond and potentially taking it to another location. But it also prevents the animals that are, within the tank from getting out, jumping into the tank next door. Looking at rodent control, especially if they have an area of the facility where they're storing their feed, making sure that they have proper rodent control there as well as the rest of the facility. As I mentioned, there are some aquatic animal pathogens that have intermediate hosts, so they may want to look at pest control for those intermediate hosts, such as snails around the edge of a pond. They could have, in one way to decrease, predator access would be to enclose the facility within a building or a structure to prevent susceptible species or other predators from coming in. So some of the red flags are that they have no predator control, especially if we're talking about really open, areas such as ponds or raceways. Gaps in pest control. So, this picture on the right here is an enclosed building, which definitely helps with preventing animals from coming in and out and getting, and potentially introducing or taking pathogens in and out of the facility. But if the door is left open, that's not necessarily doing its job. So looking for those gaps in pest control. And then also that there's no susceptible species control. So for the susceptible species that are on the farm or could come into the farm, that there's not proper control. A good example is for, if there's a shrimp farm that's next to a bay and they have a chain link fence, that chain link fence could do a really good job of preventing a lot of larger predators from coming in and out. But it won't prevent crabs from coming from the shore, climbing through the chain link fence and going onto the facility, which could carry some of the diseases of concern for the shrimp that are on that facility. So things like that, making sure that the type of control that they have in place is really addressing the needs and the risks of the facility. The last category here for vectors and fomites is mortality disposal. So making sure that, they're not only doing daily checks for mortalities and moribund fish, but also keeping records of those and then properly removing and disposing of them. Disposing of them in a secure location where there isn't access for birds or rodents or other susceptible species to get to those carcasses. This picture here is in an enclosed area. There's screens up, so, birds can't get in. But if you see in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a gap between where the screen is and the actual floor. So you could have, some sort of predator or pest come in that way and then back out again. So for mortalities, you want to look for mortality records. If they don't have any, that would be a red flag. And then secure access of wherever they are disposing of the mort. For cleaning and disinfection, it's good if they have written cleaning protocols, especially including the types of disinfection products that they use and the protocol, logs of how that, when that disinfection was done. So, tank 12 was bleached, last Tuesday, that kind of thing. And then some kind of oversight of the disinfectant use. So, a lot of just like with terrestrial situations, when we have footpaths, there's certain concentrations that need to be met. Same with when we're bleaching a tank or something like that, making sure that we're not only using the correct disinfectant, but that it's also being used in the proper manner. So some red flags would be that there's no logs or records maintained for cleaning and disinfection, or there's no documentation of, what to use for what, that kind of thing. There's no SOPs for the disinfectant, the minimum time that should be used for the disinfectant and the contact time that's required and that kind of thing, and the formula. So the picture here is technically a written cleaning plan. It's a little small to read, but I mean, it's saying, pick up the trash and hang the dip net and check that the air stones and the water flow is correct in the tank, those are all good things to be doing at the facility. In this case, they do it at the end of the day for animal husbandry. But we're really looking for, more detailed cleaning and disinfection protocols, and also tracking of that within the facility. That's going to get you the highest marks for cleaning and disinfection biosecurity. Oh. Apologies. Somehow it went to the end. Okay, the next section of biosecurity is physical facility security. So this could include perimeter security, having a visitor log, on-site security such as cameras or personnel, dogs, things like that. The on-site and perimeter security, again, cameras, security, personnel, fencing. There are some facilities that are located on an actual island. That would be a type of physical isolation. For the visitor log, making sure that not only do they have a visitor log, but that it's actually being used is important to look for. And then, if they're making sure that they're noting, when was the last time, especially if you're a veterinarian coming onto a facility or someone who visits multiple aquaculture farms, including some kind of notes on when the last time you visited an aquaculture farm was. So red flags for physical security would be that there's no control or monitoring of facility access, and that there's no visitor log, or if there is a visitor log, that it isn't being used correctly. And then we have emergency planning. So this is sometimes something that gets overlooked, but is really important. And so, checking to see if they have available contact information should something go wrong. You will see, similar to a lot of other farming types, there are a lot of aquaculture facilities where everything is, the producer can get access to all the different systems on his phone from wherever he is or she is. But that's not always the case. So making sure that there's available contact information, that there's some sort of a backup plan for if equipment goes down and they need supportive care for the animals that are there so they can get through. And animal health and personnel emergency protocols. So some red flags would be that there's no emergency procedures for a loss of power, or what happens if they lose their water flow or there's an equipment malfunction. So thinking about those things, and then that there's no emergency contact information available. Again, these are all areas of good biosecurity, and it will depend on the facility as to what makes the most sense for them. But I just wanted to give you a couple of different examples to think about while you're out on these facility inspections. So to recap for biosecurity, for the purposes of the Registered Aquaculture Export Facility inspection program, there's only two categories that are required by APHIS. They need to have a written, effective biosecurity plan, and they need to have documentation of employee biosecurity training. All of these other areas that we talked about with biosecurity regarding animals, water, feed, vectors, fomites, emergency planning, all of those other things, they're part of a good biosecurity plan, but they're not required to be in place by APHIS. And then the one caveat to that I mentioned at the beginning is that they may be required in order to export to certain countries. So that's important. That'll be an important part of the information gathering part prior to conducting this inspection, is making sure that whatever countries this facility is looking to export to, that we take note of any sort of biosecurity requirements that we need to make sure that the facility is meeting in order to export to that country. So now we're going to go over an example. This is similar to the one we did yesterday, but today we're going to talk about how to approve a facility to export Atlantic halibut to Canada. So similarly, we're going to ask some of the same questions that we did last time. So what country is this facility seeking approval to export to? And they want to go to Canada. They want to send Atlantic halibut. And they want to send both fish and eggs. We want to know whether or not registration is required for this species to Canada. So when we go onto the IREGs, we see that no, registration is not required. But the facility has decided that they want to still be inspected and approved for Canada for this species in order to decrease the user fees that they have to pay for certificate endorsement. So that's okay, because the next question is, are there written export requirements for this species that we can base an inspection on? And so we do have something in writing that outlines the requirements. So we'll go through those in more detail and then look at how we would complete Part 2 of the inspection checklist. So for Part 1, this is my made-up facility of hungry halibut, and they culture both adults and they have eggs on the facility. That's the general facility information. Then when we get to, in order to prepare to complete Part 2, we want to find out what the export requirements are. So this first screenshot at the top is from the IREGs, and we can see that there's a health certificate for aquatic animals and germplasm, and for Canada, they have health certificates broken down. Many of them are broken down by the end use. So this particular facility is sending them, wants to send these animals and germplasm for culture. So we find the culture health certificate. There's no registration note on Canada's page, so we know that registration is not required for this species to this country. But we do have the health certificate, and then as far as other written guidance, you can see down below, there's instructions. And then there's also, on this IREGs page, there's additional information about susceptible species, sampling, test methodology, things like that, that apply to exports of aquatic animals to Canada. So we want to look at all of those resources to make sure that we completely understand what the requirements are. When we pull up the health certificate, this particular facility is just going to send animals every once in a while, so they're going to use the what we call the test and ship option for Canada. So basically, the animals have to be tested and test negative for the diseases of concern within 30 days. So Canada has very specific requirements about how to meet that test negative health status for the 2 different diseases of concern for halibut, and you know, how to sample, the types of test methods that should be used, the type of lab, that kind of thing. So this is where we're gathering all of that information to make sure we understand all of the export requirements. And then we can start, you know, then as we're doing the facility inspection, we can start going through and completing the Part 2, Section A. So Section A will cover, you know, are there requirements posted on the IREGs? The answer to that is yes. Were they reviewed, and is the facility meeting all of those requirements, and are they attached to this inspection package? All of those should be yes. Then as far as whether or not Canada requires premises freedom versus test negative health status for those diseases of concern, because the facility is going to choose the test and ship option, we would select that, you know, they're going to be going under the test negative health status according to Canada. And then we'll go through the testing parameters in just a second. So when we go to the species approved for export, this facility only has halibut on site. So the answer to the first question, unlike yesterday's example, is that do all of the species listed in Part 1 of the inspection checklist meet the requirements for export? In this case, the answer is yes, because they only have halibut on the facility and they're only seeking approval to send halibut to Canada. The next section is specific end use. Only, this question is if it's applicable. So in this case, the export requirements are specific to the end use, which is culture for these animals. So we indicate that yes, there's a specific end use and that it is for culture here on the inspection checklist. The next section is talking about export testing. So for those of you that have been that have reviewed or been involved in exports to Canada in the past, Canada is very specific about the type of test that's used, where that testing is performed, whether or not animals can be pooled into, grouped in samples before the tests are run, that kind of thing. So that's where you're really going to focus on making sure that you complete the table according to the country's requirements. So I know this table is small, but it's, it's talking about the two diseases of concern for this species are VHS and IPN. They used the correct test method. There was no pooling performed. It was tested within the time frame that's required. The testing is being done at an APHIS-approved lab, so the correct laboratory for this country based on the health certificate. So we went through the export testing guidance that will be posted on our IREG's homepage yesterday, and that's where you would, pull up the health certificate next to that guidance, look at the language on there, and make sure that the language about testing indicates that it has to be done at an APHIS-approved lab. Then the last section of Part 2 is for additional comments. So one thing that I put in here is that because these animals are being tested right before they ship, so they're looking at the test negative status of that group at that time within 30 days, the facility understands that they need to do that prior to every shipment. So while we verified that they are doing that testing, at the time of inspection, they may not be planning, maybe they only export in the spring. And so there's a couple of months between now and then. So you could add in the additional comments that the facility understands that before they ship the next time to Canada, they need to do the testing within 30 days prior to export. So we are verifying that the facility understands how to do the testing, that it's being done at all of the, the appropriate test method and the appropriate lab and the pooling standards and all of that kind of stuff that's specific for this species to this country. We're verifying all of that information during the inspection, but then it's going to also be important that we're verifying at the time of health certificate endorsement that the testing is meeting that time frame for this particular species to this country, and based on the health statements that the facility has selected. So then lastly, once we've completed all of our inspection checklist and the facility is meeting all of the requirements, we would issue an approval letter. The approval letter template is on our SharePoint page, and the basic areas that will always be addressed are the date of inspection, the facility's information, then specifically what country we're approving them to export to. So in this case, we're approving them to export to Canada, and we're approving them what species. So we're approving them to export Atlantic halibut, and then both the fish and the eggs. And then later on down in further down in the approval letter will be the date that the approval expires, and letting them know that, the approval is good for a year, that they need to contact us to renew it, and that kind of general language that we typically have on an approval letter. So as I mentioned, this full example, so I completed all three parts of the inspection checklist. the export requirements that are all on the IREGs are all attached under the example that's on our SharePoint for Canada. So there's all of that information is on inspection checklist, and then a copy of the mock approval letter is also there as well for you to go and take a look at. So in summary, we talked a lot about biosecurity today, and so you know, one of the reasons that I really wanted to focus on biosecurity for this inspection is that, you know, we have a lot of VMO inspectors that, you know, have a very wide, vast, and different experience with facility inspections. And so I really want to, again, encourage you to draw on the experience that you have with other live animals, with other product facility inspections that you do, laboratory inspections that you do. You know, really that same sort of critical thinking at pathways of pathogen introduction is going to be applied to aquatic animal facilities as well. You want to look at the 5 principal pathways, so animals, water, feed, vectors, and fomites. You want to look at, you know, the pathways of not only those pathogens coming in through those pathways onto the facility, but also how they could be leaving the facility, and then evaluating the biosecurity at the different levels, so at the premises itself, within any populations on the premises, and then also at the tank level. And then as you're going through the inspection checklist, just as a reminder for this registration program, all we need to verify during the inspection is that there's a written effective biosecurity plan, and that is, you know, that is up to you as the inspector to determine if they have a written effective biosecurity plan, and that there is documentation, there's employee biosecurity training. All of the other areas that we talked about, you know, are every time I go onto a farm, it's always a learning opportunity. I'm a fresh pair of eyes. And there's no, I've yet to see, aside from, you know, super biosecure labs, there's no perfect biosecurity anywhere. And it's always just, you know, something where there can be, it may be an opportunity to improve. And so, you know, looking for those red flags and will help you to better understand the biosecurity of the facility, to better understand and maybe ask questions so that you can better understand the flow of animals, the flow of water, things like that. All of that will help you in your understanding of the facility. And then, you know, an opportunity to discuss the risks and possible areas of improvement with the facility. And then for the part 2 of the inspection checklist for biosecurity, making sure that if there's any country-specific requirements, that we're verifying that during the time of inspection as well, before we approve them to export a species to that country. And then we have the example that I mentioned that we just went through, that I mentioned is posted on the SharePoint site. So that is what we've covered today. Here's my contact information if you don't already have it. And with that, I will pause and take any questions. I saw quite a few coming through on the chat, so I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Okay, and as a reminder, you can submit a written question by selecting all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, entering your message into the box that's provided, and then sending.
So we'll start with our first question. Are there aquatic biosecurity guidelines we can share with these facilities along the lines of biosecurity recommendations by the Secure Beef Supply or Secure Pork Supply?
So that's a really good question. We don't specifically have a secure food supply program or set of instructions for aquaculture. There's definitely a lot of really great resources out there, and I've been working with the commodity staff to kind of compile some of that, and definitely plan on, you know, posting some of that on our SharePoint page or on our web page. So we don't have any, we don't have an APHIS specific guidance that on biosecurity that I could provide, but there's a lot of really great resources that have been done by extension groups and other veterinary groups, that kind of thing. So I will plan to post that in the coming weeks as a reference.
Okay, can you please repeat the information about Part 1, Section P, not been a requirement by APHIS?
Yeah, so what you'll see on the Part 1 section of the inspection checklist is that Section P talks about biosecurity. So we talked at the beginning that there's, the first two questions are, is there a written effective biosecurity plan, and is there training for employees on biosecurity that is documented? So those first two questions have to be yes in order for us to approve the facility. Those are the only requirements that we have for APHIS that we say that all facilities need to meet this in order for us to approve them. All of the other areas that we went through that you'll see on the inspection checklist that talk about animal sources and feed and cleaning and disinfection, all those other areas of biosecurity they're not requirements. They're just there to kind of give you some ideas of what to look for, what to ask about while you're at the facility, and then also to document what they do have so that we have some sort of record of what type of biosecurity the facility does have. There's no right or wrong answer. There aren't some check boxes that have to be there and others that, the others that don't. It's really just a resource for you to be able to have a lot of areas to look at and ask questions about, and then to document what's going on at the facility. So it's a little bit different than some of our other facility inspections, where this section is, there's the first two questions of this is the biosecurity requirement to be part of this registration program, and then everything else is just sort of a reference to help you evaluate the biosecurity while you're there at the facility.
Okay. The next question is, I have a facility inspection on the 24th of September, and I know from yesterday that the start date for the new inspection information is the 28th. In the best of all worlds, to make everyone's life a bit easier, is it best to, A, stick with the old tried and true method of narrative in 17-137, use the new and improved checklist, or do what I want because I'm an independent thinker?
I always encourage independent thinking. It's technically, since it was done on the 24th, or will be done on the 24th, you can use the old documents. I would encourage you to try out the new ones, and feel free to reach out to me. I think that, if you have any questions, I think that it would just, I think that you'll find them easier to use, and it will only help you for next year when you do go back to do the inspection. They will have already gone through that process. So that, technically speaking, you don't need to start using the new documents until the 28th or after, but feel free to use them beforehand.
The next question is there a good reference for commonly used disinfection in aquaculture for those of us that aren't familiar?
It will depend on the pathogen, and I don't have that information available like right at my fingertips, but it's definitely something that I know I talk a fair amount about with our commodity staff, and as we're looking at FAD response and that kind of thing. So we can, that's definitely something that we can work on putting together and make more widely available.
Okay. If VS has no specific biosecurity requirements and red flags are seen, what is the role of the VS inspector? Do red flags preclude the DS inspector for checking yes to the question, or does the facility have an effective biosecurity plan?
Yeah, so you know, this is a gray area, and this is where it's really you know, a case by case situation that you need to look at a lot of factors. So there may be biosecurity components that are missing from a facility, but because of the type of facility, because of the type of animals being raised, because of the type of you know, water that's going through the facility, all of these different factors that we talked about today, just because one biosecurity component may be missing doesn't mean that they don't have an effective biosecurity plan. So it really is up to you as the inspector to talk to the facility, understand the facility and all their various risks to determine whether or not what they do have in place is effective. And then I would encourage you, if that area that is missing, if they have one of those red flags, that's an area of discussion that you can discuss with the facility about how they can improve biosecurity in that particular area. There may be other categories where, you know, other components of biosecurity where if they do have a red flag, it's you know, that particular red flag for that particular facility means that their biosecurity facility is not effective. You know, they have, you know, they bring in new animals all the time and they're constantly mixing, and there's no sort of, you know, the disease is passing from one area to the other. They have really high, you know, it's not a simple black and white thing, and as veterinarians, we deal with that a lot. So it's really up to you as a veterinarian to evaluate what's there, what are the risks, and determine if it's effective. And if you have any questions, that is absolutely something that I really encourage you to reach out to myself, to Kathleen Hartman, to the other aquaculture liaisons, and ask questions, because we're here to help you, and you know, you're not on your own.
This is around the same kind of question. It says VS has no standard protocol for what is in a biosecurity SOP. Given that, are the red flag guidelines for a best management practice for a facility, or do all the red flags need to be completed before an approval is granted? If the latter, it kind of then applies the VS doesn't have a standard that needs to be followed for biosecurity SOP.
Yeah, so we do not have an SOP that has to be followed. As I mentioned, the only requirements are that there's an effective written biosecurity plan and that there's training. And all of those red flags are just things to, in case you don't already think about them when you're out doing a facility inspection, just things to look for that mean that maybe there's, you know, maybe there's gaps in biosecurity that you should look at closer. And yeah, I think I kind of answered that in some previous questions too, but if you have any additional questions, please let me know about that.
The next question is, some of these facilities drain directly into local waterways without treatment. Are we concerned at all with that, or just with infection/contamination of other ponds on the farm? Also, what do the red flags mean as a part of the inspection? Changes that need to be made? Will you make the decision on approval based on these red flags, and you want us to just list what we find, or do we need to inform them about possible changes that need to be made? That's a long question. So I guess the first part of it is, are we concerned at all with the fact that they're draining into local waterways, or just infection contamination?
Yeah, so when we are looking at draining out of the facility, effluent discharge, you know, there are certain requirements that they have to meet for the EPA, for example, but for a lot of the animal diseases that we're concerned about, there isn't always that much regulation. There might be some regulation at the state level, we don't have a specific APHIS requirement for effluent, for treating the effluent, the water that's leaving the facility. I do think that, sometimes with biosecurity, we focus a lot on, what's coming onto the farm, but I think it's also important to look at what's leaving the farm. And if you notice that there are some of those red flag areas or some of those gaps in biosecurity, that is, those are opportunities to have a discussion with the facility about, hey, if your animals are infected with disease X and you discharge it through the water, it can carry through the water and it could infect the wild populations that are susceptible, on your doorstep, for example, something like that. So it's an opportunity to have a discussion. We don't necessarily have any regulations from the APHIS level. There might be some at the state or local or EPA level. So it will really vary on the type of facility and that kind of thing. But it's something to think about, and it's something to talk about with the facility.
Okay. Oh, the other question or comment we had was, please remember to send aquaculture SharePoint and website information to us. I get lost trying to find SharePoint-specific sites on our USDA website. You're not the only one.
Nope.
Some of us do not go to these locations except rarely. I agree. The next question is, if they have a plan but do not follow any aspect, what is the point of having the plan? Would we have any liability in the event of disease spread on an export?
So if they have a plan in place, but it's just a plan on paper, I'm hearing, versus, it's not actually being implemented at the facility, then, it's not really an effective biosecurity plan because they're not carrying out the components of the biosecurity plan. As far as, culpability with sending diseased animals to other countries, it happens, but the biggest, when it comes to export, the most important thing is that we're making sure that we're checking everything that we can on our end. So making sure that if the country they want to send to has certain biosecurity requirements, that those are all being met during our inspection. That any kind of disease testing that's required, that's being done correctly at the facility before export. It can be a challenging thing. I've definitely seen biosecurity plans that are just written and not implemented, but that would not be an effective biosecurity plan because you're not actually mitigating any kind of disease movement within or onto or off the farm with that plan. So I would not approve that facility. And again, we can talk more if there's a specific, case or, facility that you visited or what have you offline. I'd be happy to talk more in detail with you about that.
So the next question is, what is the minimal acceptable length of time for a tank to live fallow?
It would depend. It would depend on a lot of factors. It would depend on your disease's concern, and I don't know that off the top of my head. It would also depend on the species and your production style, that kind of thing. So I'm happy if you have a specific disease or commodity of interest, please shoot me an email. But it really will depend.
So can a facility that harvests brine shrimp eggs in an open lake, processes the eggs and sells them as eggs, become a registered facility?
As long as they can meet, so the facility where they're bringing the eggs to and processing them, as long as they can meet the export requirements to whatever country they want to send the brine shrimp to, then yes. Brine shrimp fall into kind of an odd category where some countries consider them to be live animals, and some countries consider them to be products if they're going in their cyst form. So there may be different inspection requirements depending on whether the country, the destination country, considers it an animal or a product. But yes, if there was a, for example, Uruguay considers it a live animal, we could go to the facility where they're bringing the eggs to and evaluate that, inspect that, and approve them as long as they're meeting their export requirements for that species to Uruguay.
So regarding Part 2 of the checklist, meeting country-specific requirements, does the inspecting VMO complete this, and will there be training on this portion?
Yes. So that all 3 parts of the inspection checklist are completed by the VMO inspector. And we went over that a bit yesterday. There's also an annotated version and examples that are on SharePoint, which are really good resources to go through if you have specific questions about how to answer something, or what a question's asking, or how to complete something. Then please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Okay. The next question is, I saw the export alert email that can be shared with industry. Is there further information regarding how to access the September 22nd webinar and that we can share with the industry?
So I'm working on that. I should be sending, I was focused on these webinars this week for our VS staff, but that webinar will be recorded. And I'm not exactly sure how we'll get that out to folks after the fact, but VS employees are more than welcome to listen into that. And it will be recorded, and it will somehow get back out to folks after the fact.
Yeah, we can maybe send it up to the NTEP site too. That's an open-facing site that they can see. There was another comment about the question if a facility doesn't have a plan but does not follow any aspects, what is the point? How do we, would we have any liability in the event of disease spread? And the other question about that was, if the disease is spread due to a lack of biosecurity?
Yeah, so, if the disease is, this isn't a domestic program. This is a registration program for export. So we're just talking about, how this would apply to if there was an FAD, within the U.S. and it was spread to another facility within the U.S. That I would defer to our commodity and our FAD staff for that. For exports, it definitely, we definitely would not look good if the country-specific requirements said that these, biosecurity parameters X, Y, and Z need to be met, and we signed off on that, and it turns out that, one of those or all of those were not actually in place and being implemented at the facility. So that is a big deal, and we want to make sure that, especially for those country-specific requirements, that we are really making sure that it's not only part of, their written plan, but that it's being met and being regularly used at the facility.
Okay, the next question is, on initial application, the facility can submit a workable biosecurity plan. However, is it only during the renewal period that we can efficiently measure if their biosecurity plan is effective? Meaning they carry out on the E-plan by record of employee training record or on spot inspection visit is mandated?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think, requesting the facility to send a copy of their biosecurity plan before you go out to do the facility inspection is never a bad idea to look it over. they may be sending you other materials to look at, you know, for you to review before you get to the facility anyway. You know, before you even go out to do the site inspection, you should know what the required criteria are for the countries that they're exporting to, and make sure that you know what exactly you need to verify is going on there. Having the plan in advance can maybe help you to either, you know, direct you to areas you may need to look at, look further into, et cetera. But it's, you know, like our previous question said, just because it's in writing doesn't mean that it's actually being carried out at the facility. So I would recommend that you get, you know, that you get a copy of something in advance. But even on the initial inspection, you need to be looking at whether or not the biosecurity that they have at the facility is effective for their species and management style before we approve them, before that initial approval, and then we need to be doing it during subsequent years as well, during their renewals.
So the last question we have in the chat, someone missed the first part of the training, and they're questioning whether testing and biosecurity requirements, are they found on the IREGs and health certificate?
Yeah, so those are probably going to be the two most common locations that you're going to look for. And there are, you know, it will depend on the country. Some countries, you know, everything you need may be on the health certificate, and it's a one-stop shop and you're good to go. Like the example we went through with Canada today, there's additional supplemental documents that are on the IREGs that you need to look at. There's, in order to really understand all of the export requirements. There's also additional guidance that we have that we'll be posting on our IREGs homepage specific to aquatic animal exports, and so that will be a reference for you as well. There are some countries where we have interpretations of you know, what exactly the requirements mean on the health certificate. We have a live animal export database alerts that go out about those for our own internal communication, so that's another place to look. And then the other kind of big category would be if they have an import permit or something, you know, that they receive in writing from the country that they want to send animals to that outlines the export requirements. We can use that as well.
Okay. And the last thing we have is I think field inspectors need clearer guidance about what is considered an effective biosecurity plan. That's a comment.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that it's a gray area, and you know, unfortunately, I tried to really give you some areas of with the red flags, like they are to get you thinking about, you know, evaluating the biosecurity plan that's there. It's so variable based on the facility that you're at, the layout, the water flow, the animals, all of that kind of thing. There's just so many variables. And so I think that it's just something that will come with experience. Please reach out to, you know, to myself, to the other aquaculture liaisons, to the commodity staff, Dr. Kathleen Hartman. You know, we're all here to collectively, you know, help however we can. So it is a learning process. You know, there's pros and cons to the export requirement being kind of vague, right? So it gives a lot of it gives a broader number of facilities being able to meet that requirement of an effective biosecurity plan without being so prescriptive. But at the same time, it makes it a little more challenging to not just have all of the check boxes and you know, all of these items must be met. It really is up to the discretion of the veterinary inspectors, and then with support from your colleagues.
Okay, well with that, we're at the bottom of 4:30, and we don't have any other questions in the chat box. Alicia, do you want to make a reminder that this is going to be recorded?
Yeah, so thank you guys for attending today, and just as a reminder, both today's webinar and the one from yesterday were both recorded, and we're going to be posting them on the Live Animal Export SharePoint page, and we will send out a link to everybody once that's available, probably sometime next week. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, you have my contact information, and please feel free to reach out with any questions. And I appreciate your time and attention to this registration program. And yeah, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks everyone.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.